Delivering Net Zero is a project funded by the UKRI Energy and Decarbonisation Programme, which is exploring how the research community, working with other key stakeholders, can deliver an effective response to the urgent challenge of climate change. We're doing this through a process of deliberative consultation, which has taken place in 3 rounds of workshops during 2021. In our first round, we brought together representatives of the energy and decarbonisation research community to explore how we can accelerate progress towards net zero. In the second round, we took the ideas and issues articulated by that research community to groups of stakeholders from the private, public and third sectors, along with a group of organisations, both public and private, who fund innovation. It is some of the outputs of these 2 rounds of workshops that we're going to present and discuss with you today. In addition, we have just completed our 3rd round of workshops, where we took these outputs back to the research community and had a further discussion with them about their implications for the energy community as a whole. We are now busy analysing that data, and if you enjoyed the discussion this afternoon, do stay connected to us so that you receive the final report from the project next year. So, today's event is all about discussing the themes we drew from those first 2 rounds of workshops with you and the panel we have brought together for that purpose this afternoon. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce that panel to you. And I'm just going to make some changes on my screen so I can see all of them while I do that. Right, there we go. So first of all, we have Rachel Carr-Whitworth. Rachel is based in Leeds, where she works as a research assistant in a research assistant in energy demand at the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, CREDS. But alongside this, she's been working with us on delivering net zero and has been lead author for the analysis and reporting for both the first rounds. We're going to hear more from her in a few moments, but before we do, I will quickly introduce the other members of our panel. So we have Carly McLaughlin. Carly, for those of you who don't know her, is the director of Tyndall Manchester, leading an interdisciplinary team working on policy relevant research on climate change. Her research interests focus on how stakeholders, including publics, engage with energy and sustainability issues, and how evidence is used within this. So very relevant to the things we've been doing in delivering net zero. She has been an important and very helpful member of the advisory board for delivering net zero. So welcome and thank you, Carly. Then we have John Barrett. John is Professor in Energy and Climate Policy at the University of Leeds. And more importantly, from my perspective, is the principal investigator on delivering net zero. But that's only part of his day job. His research interests include energy demand, resource productivity, energy and economy modelling, carbon accounting, and exploring the transition to a low carbon future. And he currently heads the industry, materials and products theme in the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. And he recently led a really important report they've put out on the journey towards a net zero, particularly from a demand side. So really worth looking at that report. For those of you who don't know John, I first got to know him through his involvement in UKIRK. And he was a co-director in the previous phase of UKIRK. Then we'll move on to Emily. Emily Cox is someone I have only got to know through my involvement in DNZ, but it has been a real privilege to work with her in this project. She's a research associate at Cardiff University, working on environmental policy and social psychology, with a focus on potential solutions for the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. She brings a social science dimension to this work, exploring issues like public perceptions, policy and ethics, and embedding principles of public engagement and responsible innovation in technology development. her knowledge and experience has been invaluable as we've worked on this project together. So welcome, Emily, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. And finally, Jan Webb. Jan is someone I've worked with a lot over the last decade, we work together exploring the role of local authorities in the UK's energy system. But that's not all she does. She's a professor of sociology of organisations at the University of Edinburgh and a co-director in the current phase of UKIRC. She's also a member of the Scottish Scientific Advisory Council, and like John, she sits on the Scientific Advisory Committee for the QKRI Energy Programme, which I currently chair. Her work on local authority is only part of a much broader portfolio of activity around social studies of energy and climate change, with specific interest in heat and energy efficiency governance in both local and regional energy systems. So there's our panel, but I will now go back to Rachel, who's going to provide us with an overview of what came out of our round 1 and round 2 workshops. Over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Mike. I'll just start sharing my screen. So I'm going to be presenting on the results from the first round of workshops we've done with academics and the second round of workshops with a group of stakeholders, like Mike just said. So a brief overview of what we've done so far. So we've undertaken a thematic analysis based on coding of the transcriptions from the workshops. And this has sort of surfaced 8 high-level themes from round 1 and a further 8 from round 2. So this presentation will focus on the round 1 themes with academics, but I'll also be providing some comparisons to what was said in round 2. And we've got the report going into this in much more detail available on our website, and the round 2 report will be published shortly as well. So I'm going to jump straight into the themes. So firstly, we've got the need to develop social legitimacy for an ambitious decarbonisation pathway. So in the workshops with academics, there was this strong idea that there's a need to establish stronger social legitimacy for net zero. This was also described as the sort of social mandate or the social acceptability of change. And it was felt like there's broad legitimacy among the public for the need to reduce emissions, but this is lacking for sector-specific solutions, particularly those that are more intrusive into people's lives. And this was discussed in relation to the need for a more active public debate, improved communication, education, both for the public, but also for decision makers, improving trust in decision makers and using sort of more participatory decision-making processes. So in round 2 with stakeholders, there was quite a similar emphasis on the need to improve public engagement and widen public participation. And there was quite a strong emphasis as well on the need for this to be bottom-up and quite citizen-led, which they felt was necessary for ensuring this is a just transition. So the next theme we have is the need to rapidly roll out ready-to-go solutions and technologies. So in the academic workshops, there was sort of across different sectors, there was quite a strong prioritization of the need to rapidly deploy solutions which were deemed sort of ready to go and able to provide rapid reductions to cumulative emissions. So this was discussed in relation to updating electricity infrastructure, improving energy system flexibility and storage, expanding offshore wind, electric vehicle charging, expanding active and public transport infrastructure, heat pump and retrofit programs, and nature-based greenhouse gas removal technologies. So quite a broad range of options here, but they were sort of similarly conceptualized as areas where we just sort of need to get on with deployment. In round 2, there was a similar focus on the urgency of deploying what they sort of termed as low regret solutions. This is particularly in transport and heat decarbonisation, but also more broadly. And they had this quite strong emphasis on learning by doing. So this idea that deployment should be a bit of an iterative process where we sort of accept that some projects might fail and mistakes might be made, but we can sort of learn from this, and it's a greater risk to fail to act rather than to sort of act rapidly. So next, we've got the need to improve readiness of solutions and roll out infrastructure for the long term. So there's this idea that there's a need to improve readiness of solutions in the most challenging to decarbonise sectors. So this was discussed a lot, particularly in relation to greenhouse gas removal. For example, developing CCS transport and storage infrastructure, developing monitoring, reporting and verification protocols for different GGR techniques. And it was also discussed in relation to sort of rolling out demonstration projects, followed by successful technologies in sort of heavy industry, aviation and shipping, large-scale energy storage and flexibility. In round 2 with the stakeholders, this wasn't so much of a prominent theme. They focused their priorities a lot more in the short term rather than sort of improving readiness for the long term. So next we have the need to upskill and capacity build in the workforce and government. So there was this strong idea that there's a real lack of the necessary skills in the workforce that are needed to deploy net zero infrastructure. And this was sort of combined equally with a need to build capacity in government to also oversee changes and sort of reversal of the outsourcing that's occurred over past decades, and particularly building capacity in local authorities to enable them to deliver sort of localized solutions and also widen sort of participation and engagement on a local scale. In round 2, there was a really similar emphasis on identifying a skills gap as a significant barrier to accelerating change, and feeling that more funding and resources and also collaborations with private sector, researchers, other organisations were needed to sort of help local authorities to deliver change. Next, we have the need for a more active and interventionist policy approach. So in the academic workshops, participants called for a sort of whole systems plan for decarbonisation from government that was linked to regulation. They felt that government needed to make some key decisions regarding the role of certain technologies, and that government strategy needed to involve much stronger intervention as well as sort of market-driven solutions which have dominated historically. In the stakeholder workshops, there were quite similar calls for a clear strategy from government combined with stronger regulation, and this is particularly from the private sector and local authorities. There was more of a dislike around the framing of policy as interventionist, which was seen as too top-down, but they did sort of also identify a whole range of policy barriers preventing this kind of bold or brave policy that they were calling for, including sort of short-termism, the risk aversion of decision makers, a lack of alignment across different government departments and scales, which some sort of felt amounted to a sort of political inertia. And they felt that there was this unanswered political science question of how do we actually overcome this inertia, or how do we deliver change in spite of political institutions being sort of slow to move. So next we have the need for continued investment into new potentially disruptive solutions. So this was particularly discussed in relation, so the need to continue investing in research and development to support all stages of innovation through to the commercial deployment of solutions. So this is particularly discussed in relation to energy supply and greenhouse gas removal, where it was felt that technological innovation is still needed in areas like energy storage and flexibility, offshore hydrogen, BECCS, DAC, and various other potentially sort of ocean-based greenhouse gas removal solutions. This was not really a prominent theme at all in the stakeholder workshops, where there was a much stronger emphasis on the need to deploy existing solutions. So finally, I've slightly grouped two themes together here, as there's quite an overlap, so it's interesting to talk about them together. We've got the sort of social and political feasibility of solutions and technological optimism in systems change. So in the academic workshops, there was some quite different perspectives around what solutions are deemed feasible and sort of how fast they can be implemented, particularly in those that are aimed at significant energy demand reduction. So this sort of also differences in opinion fed into sort of broader differences around whether participants felt net zero could be done within current socio-technical systems, or whether there's need for more transformative systemic change. So, for example, some felt that there's a need to move away from economic growth, to move to sort of and sort of transform political systems. In the stakeholder workshops, this played out slightly differently. There was a strong sense of urgency and the need for more aggressive timelines around decarbonisation, but sort of less debate around around sort of current systems versus systemic change. They did raise quite strong concerns around narratives which rely on sort of silver bullet technologies. And overall there was sort of more of a sense that there's a need to bring the sort of social and technical change together. So finally, I'm just going to go over a few additional themes that came up in the stakeholder workshops, which weren't as prominent in the workshops with the research community. So first we have a just transition. So this was really, really prominent in the stakeholder workshops. They felt that net zero should also be reducing social inequalities, and that there's a strong potential for co-benefits, including reducing fuel poverty, improving public health and job creation. And overall, there needs to be a better articulation of the distributional impacts of net zero. So who will pay, where will jobs be created, and whose behaviour needs to change. And this was also sort of linked to the idea I was talking about before of better engagement and sort of participatory decision making. Next, we have a theme around funding. So the need for a clearer picture on how net zero will be funded. Many look to government to provide access to low-cost finance and to the private sector to innovate around business models, but there was lots of barriers to funding that were identified. And they also felt that there was an overarching question of sort of how do we rapidly redirect flows of capital and sort of realign the private sector with net zero. And finally, I have a theme around sort of responsibility and collaboration. So there were sort of different perspectives around who has responsibility to drive net zero. The private sector and local authorities both looked quite strongly to central government and to government ministers to act, whereas in the third sector there was more of an emphasis on the idea that there's no one sort of systems architect and that we need to take collective responsibility. Overall, there was quite a lot of discussion around the need to sort of improve collaborations across different scales of government, between industry, government and academia, and also internationally. So I'm going to leave it there. Just quickly, the next steps of the project. We have, as Mike was saying, we've done a third round just last month, taking these themes back to the research community, and we'll be analysing these looking to produce a final report in spring next year. So thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Rachel. That was a really excellent overview of the work we've been doing for, well, 18 months now, isn't it, that we've been working on this. I'm going to turn now to our panelists and ask them to reflect for a few minutes on our overarching question. But just before I do that, if I could just ask you all now to start to engage with us and ask us some questions by putting those in the Q&A. So once each of our panelists have had a couple of minutes each to talk about their perspective, we'll be going to them with questions from the Q&A at the bottom. So if you haven't found that yet, move to the bottom of your screen, press the Q&A button and post your questions in there for us. Okay, so I am going to pass then to our panelists and ask them to, just for a couple of minutes each, to reflect on this question that we've been pursuing around the role of the research community in delivering a rapid response to the climate crisis. And I'm going to go in the order I introduced you at the start. So I'll go to Carly first, if that's okay, Carly.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Mike. You know, well, there's loads in there from what Rachel's presented and from the reports. And so I'll just try and pick a couple of things out that really struck me. So one is that, you know, people are talking about really different things when they say delivering net zero, because we don't have a date in there. We've mashed together removals as well as emissions reduction. There's not a specific reference to, you know, delivering net zero in line with our Paris climate change agreement. So actually, in some ways, that's hugely beneficial because it allows all kinds of people to come to the party who want to be on board with this idea of delivering net zero. But I wonder if it also causes us some issues because people are really talking about quite different things. And I suppose it's made me reflect on whether, as researchers, we need to be very clear about what we're talking about. Are we talking about delivering elements of net zero that are about chunky emissions reductions within this decade of action? Or are we talking about technologies and ways of working that might be part of a future net zero system that's become even more efficient and fantastic and allowed us to do all kinds of things, but it isn't about that near-term delivery? And then the other thing that struck me was around the stakeholders asking for research to be really accessible. And I think drawing on the work that we've been doing, particularly with Greater Manchester Combined Authority, it's just the sense that, you know, we put a lot of effort into making outputs, you know, not behind a paywall and inaccessible language and things like that. But actually what we found there is authorities are often so limited in their resource, and they really want someone to kind of come on the journey with them and research with them and learn with them and be, you know, a kind of co-producing team. And that's a kind of different way of thinking about research, and it takes a lot of time. And so being very clear where that's the element of research we want to do, rather than doing something and then disseminating it in the best way. And I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks, Carly. Brilliant. John.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, Rachel. That's excellent. I suppose the first thing that comes out to me on it is similar to Carly's point, but from a slightly different perspective, and that's a need for us as researchers to frame our solutions that align with the climate science and the cumulative emissions that we have. And I know we have a target to reduce emissions 78% by 2035 compared to 1990 levels, but there are also other framings which demonstrate that we need to move at a quicker speed. And while I don't want to get into huge debates about what should our carbon budgets be, what that tells me is that we need to do as much as we can as soon as we possibly can. And that framing, I think, is quite useful. And as researchers, maybe that's something that we should all be visiting when we're thinking about how we are both the research we're undertaking and how we're disseminating that research. And in essence, that really means that we involve or we are required then to deliver robust evidence that also challenges current thinking. We need to be both supportive where we can be, but also question the direction of travel when, in essence, it doesn't deliver even on the targets, whether they are enough or not, that the government has committed to. Added to that as well, I think, and having thinking about all the workshops with all the stakeholders, we also need to have a certain responsibility to provide a positive narrative of the future. It's very easy to say what doesn't work and that's wrong and this is wrong. And I found that with the stakeholders when we engage with them is that we need to actually take responsibility for providing a positive vision, not telling them that everything that's done is wrong, while not also shying away from the challenges of incumbents and vested interests and be honest about why certain technologies are not rolling out, or the balance between technologies and social transformations and so on. So in essence, that means remaining supportive, but also independent. And that's not an easy line as researchers to try and find the pathway to go along. But overall, I think the key message that I found that's come out of this is that we do actually really have a responsibility to frame what can be done in the short term and provide the answers or at least the evidence for people to be able to formulate their response based on that. So thank you.
Thanks, John. I'll move on then to Emily.
Yeah, great, thank you. And yeah, John, totally agree. As academics, we can be so critical sometimes, and it's so much easier to criticise what other people are doing than to come up with your own solutions, right? But I mean, like Carly, I'm going to pick up on a couple of specific things from these workshops. And one of the reasons that I got interested in this project in the first place is this idea of building this whole systems narrative for net zero. And because I mainly work on greenhouse gas removal, and that was included alongside energy supply and energy demand from the start. And so I was quite interested, I wasn't particularly surprised to see how siloed greenhouse gas removal is from all of the rest of the energy discussion. And we tried various sort of methodological tactics to overcome this in the workshops, but it was very, very persistent. And it's kind of evident even in the fact that I'm now a separate person in a webinar focusing on carbon removal separately from everything else. But, you know, there are major implications for the whole of the rest of the energy transition. For example, the less we do on energy demand, the more removals we're going to need. The more removals we do, the more energy supply we're going to need to meet the energy requirements of these techniques, right? And so carbon removal or greenhouse gas removal, whatever you want to call it, needs to be thought about in a much more holistic way. And we need to look at the co-benefits and the trade-offs across the energy system. As with in a UCAC seminar, I'd like to see carbon removal being treated as a component of energy systems, not just in terms of models and pathways, but also in terms of the kind of implications for the social and political feasibility of the transition. And just to briefly comment on some broader questions, I think this project has raised some really interesting questions about what this delivery of net zero actually looks like and the role of research within that. So our stakeholders were a bit concerned that researchers are too focused on developing new solutions rather than delivering the ones that we've got. And incidentally, the stakeholders, as Rachel pointed out, they barely mentioned carbon removal. And maybe this is connected to the perception that it's like another basket of techno fixes with no clear pathway for delivery. And so I guess I echo the call of a couple of our academic participants of the need to see this delivery as integral. Obviously, this means focusing on social and political feasibility, but also focusing on things like governance and liability and legal frameworks and all of these things that we need for delivery. And also, having more resources and more incentives for academics to actually engage with that delivery aspect, including engaging with different sectors, as Carly was just talking about. And just to end with a point that's more controversial than it should be, I think we need to stop pondering over whether or not we do large-scale carbon removal. It's about delivery. It's no longer a question of if, it's a question of where, it's a question of why, and most importantly, it's a question of how. So, thank you.
Great, thanks, Emily. So now you can see why I've enjoyed working with Emily so much over the last 18 months. And John, of course.
Thanks, Mike.
And Rachel. Jan, on to you.
Okay, thank you, and thanks everyone. I thought, in the interests of clarity and given some of the other comments I've made in some of the workshops, I'd start by spelling out what is social science research and what do I think its role is in responding to and supporting urgent action on the climate emergency. So this is my perspective on what social science is, all right? And I would start by saying social science is about interpretation rather than legislating. So that means to me fundamentally asking questions about how societies work, picking up the corner of the rug and having a look underneath it, looking beyond the surface, if you like, opening up those black boxes. And that includes analysing and holding that mirror up to society, to all of us, social, political, economic life and power relations as fundamental to that. And that, in my way of thinking about research on climate emergency, means examining our core institutions. And by that, I mean the rules and regulations and structures of society that govern our conduct, our values, our central beliefs, and which we all use, including, of course, our political leaders, to justify action and inaction. We're seeing plenty of examples of that in politics in the UK currently. So what about our society then? How do we characterise our society and its responses to the climate emergency? Our core institutions, and I am, of course, really radically simplifying some very complex debates here. Core institutions, materialistic, material values, more is better. Prioritising economic exchange, therefore, and markets as a route to continuous economic growth. Price is a centrally important metric as a form of value we talk about. It's rather, in social science terms, a reductionist version of value is to turn everything into that single scale of price. Competition, core competitiveness. How do we, the rules of competition, which we act on day to day in academic as much as in any other sphere of life. And of course, that aligns with the other core thing that I've been taught ever since I was a child, individualism. You are obliged to create your own identity in a modern capitalist consumerist society, and that means competing to achieve. We talk about meritocracy, we can also criticise the extent to which we manage that. There are, of course, in a competitive society and an individualistic society, there are bound to be a lot of losers by definition. So it's very difficult to bring everyone along. We talk about a just transition, but I suspect a lot of that, and I would argue the evidence of wealth inequalities shows that we pay lip service to concepts of justice and social justice. Of course, consumerism, core institutions geared around consumerism, and in Britain certainly we have seen a consumer identity forefronted and crafted through that careful extension of markets into wider domains of society over the last 40 years or so. And that has, of course, displaced those social protections, welfare transfers, shared risks, concepts of collective responsibility and collective agency. Technology innovation, I think Rachel's already referred to this, positioned as the main route to fixing problems that have been caused largely by the economic externalities of our markets, pollution, minor details like greenhouse gas concentrations, biodiversity loss, and of course we benefit. I would say we benefit, of course, from all of these as well as having losses and concerns about them. Very powerful science and technology knowledge as a core institution, fortunately, of advanced societies. I think we'd be in a deep hole without that. And therefore, along with that, expectations of rational and reasoned responses to evidence. But we're not, I would argue, seeing that rational and reasoned response in the context of climate crisis, because I've spent about 15 years now trying to present rational and reasoned arguments about why we need to change our public institutions in order to forefront and respond adequately to the climate science evidence, and I don't think we've done that extremely well. There's bits and pieces. So on the climate change question and what now then, means asking whether our institutions are fit for purpose in a climate crisis. Mike referred to an example of the kinds of research that we've been doing over the years, which has focused in one way and another on local action, community-based action, place-based action, working with local governments and devolved governments across different scales. The beauty of that from a social science research perspective is it touches everyone and all scales of need and of need for change. I always talk about from Wynford, a very poor, low-income social housing estate in Glasgow, to Wall Street. So from the poorest to the wealthiest and what sits behind that. And then, of course, we've tried, and I think this is core to what we need to keep doing, to examine and interact with policy formation and business developments and business thinking. There's no excuse not to do that, to seek constructive and collaborative knowledge and insights, to push for policy progress. And undoubtedly, we've seen that. We understand, I think, as researchers, that there are significant developments and achievements, but it's too slow. And certainly in relation to heat in buildings, there's a sense of inching forwards, but also backwards, and not quite being able to get that momentum to create significant shift, the tipping points, if you like. So why is that? Well, again, exaggerating some very complex and much more nuanced findings, I would say it's about the failure of our institutions of advanced market societies to enable significant and extended cross-sector collaboration in response to the collective problem actor of all time, which is the climate crisis. What's the collective actor problem there? Well, quite honestly, fundamentally, it's about saving our own skins. So instead, what we've seen in a lot of the research we've done is incentives to compete and to free ride on other parties acting first. Hang back, step back, sort of metaphorically, if not literally speaking. So what's the action or the professional responsibility on us as researchers? Well, I would say it's about interacting with any willing audiences to try and explain the dilemmas that we're in clearly and explicitly and constructively, as John also indicated, and all of us, I think, have indicated. building capacity for extended collaboration where it matters, working with coalitions of the willing. Our own work with local authorities, Carly's also referred to this, I would say, as an important example of that. You try, but it is very time and resource and energy in all senses intensive. Finding language that will be heard as it's intended and acted on, not simply set aside. And of course, behind that, the ultimate social science thing, speaking truth to power. Thank you.
Rookie mistake. Thanks, Jan. I'm going to go straight to the questions that have appeared on the Q&A. I think Jan's just given us her answer to this first question, but I will allow her to have another second or two if she wants it, but then move on to the others. And the question is, do you think that net zero can be delivered separately from wider economic and social policy? Or does net zero actually mean a new economic and social model? Jan, do you want to say anything more on that, or shall I let the others go?
One moment. No, I think the two are absolutely bound together, is probably obvious from the points that I just tried to make. I think that the new German federal government model is going to be an interesting to watch and possibly to learn from in good and bad ways, but I'll let everyone else have a go there.
Thanks, Jan. So I can't see anyone putting their hand up, so I'm going to go to Emily first.
Yeah, what a great question. What a big question. I think, you know, sorry to be an academic about it, but it kind of depends what you mean by different. Social and economic models are evolving all of the time, and it depends whether you're meaning different as in we need to completely overthrow all of these things that Jan was talking about, capitalism, individualism, things like that, or whether you're talking about a sort of gradual evolution and shifts within these models. I think if you're talking about I think net zero, yes, you probably can deliver it within economic and social models that exist at the moment. Whether you can do that in a just way is a more difficult question, I think, and I have real doubts about whether that's actually possible. But at the same time, I do believe that, considering the urgency of the situation, I do believe that it should be possible to enact reforms to what we've got, rather than having to have an entirely new system. And I think that there are some promising examples around the world of countries that have started to think about how they can measure progress in terms of things other than GDP, proposals for social economic models like basic income and stuff like this. I think these are all reforms. They're a bit different, but they're not a whole new system.
Great, thanks, Emily. Carly, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo this the sort of simple answer of being like, no, you can't do it if you don't embed it in economic and social policy. I think it's too difficult a challenge because it would mean that some parts of your system are pulling against it. And I think actually, again, looking at local authorities, you get this little microcosm of it where you've got people sort of, you know, beavering away trying to get really good green initiatives going, while somebody over here is giving planning for more car parks in the city centre. And that I think the challenge is too great for you to be able to have those things working against each other. And that's why, you know, we've been working with Greater Manchester to build like a co-benefits assessment into every decision that goes to the combined authority, so that you try to take that more rounded approach. And I think the point I would then come on to is that a new economic and social model? So trying to value different things to what we have valued in the past, which perhaps just been a kind of economic analysis. I suppose I think we need to be careful, or maybe not careful, like to not say it, but like very purposeful in the language that we use. So when we say radical, what do we mean? When we say transformation, what do we mean? Because I think it can be quite off-putting. And if we really mean it, we've got to kind of try and take people with us. If what we mean is doing lots of the things that we do already, but in a bit of a different way, so we have the same kind of decision-making structure, but we're feeding different information into it, and we're trying to represent our values as a community better within that, is that a transformation? It's quite hard to do, so maybe it is. But yeah, that's, if you can pick an answer out of there, that's what I think.
Brilliant, thanks, Carly. John.
Yeah, so I'll probably go even one step further and say that it would be a lost opportunity if we don't, as part of our next transition, try and actually transform and change wider economic and social sort of issues. Because it's not only just a climate change agenda here, but the areas where we are over-consuming are leading to detrimental effects to both us personally, through, let's say, the example of overconsumption of food, through to hugely detrimental effects on others. So we saw in the news today that lots of our electrical goods is being shipped over to Romania, where it is burnt with no health and safety by people to extract the precious metals within what we thought were recycled goods. And that's just one example of hundreds of these. You know, we see food being overly consumed, causing huge benefits, and particularly in particular low-income groups within the UK. We see people living in dreadful housing conditions and can't keep warm, or have to pay incredible expenses and make choices between basic living and heat and food and so on. So there are many areas which touch upon the climate agenda, which have huge social and economic issues. We also have a stagnant economy which only serves a very small percentage of the people. And we can be a lot cleverer at designing something which is more collaborative and actually shares the opportunities and benefits of increases in productivity and growth. So if we try and just do this by changing 10 key technologies, all these issues remain. And then if those technologies don't quite work as we hoped, we really are stuffed at that point. Whereas if we embed this in broader changes, we're in essence transforming society to be resilient against potentially future high emissions or the failure of key technologies. So I can see that Carly wants to come back on that. So I'll stop talking now. Yeah.
Is that okay, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Go for it, Carly.
Yeah, so John, I just wondered, I think you can get loads of buy-in for the idea that there are some interventions where if you design them well, they have all kinds of other co-benefits. And you know, the majority, I think, regardless of your kind of ideological or political bent, would at least say they were behind the idea of people not living in terrible housing and addressing, you know, obesity crisis and things like that. I suppose I just wondered about your reflections on when it gets to more like issues like the accumulation of wealth in a tiny proportion of society and really high consumption in, say, something like aviation, where that's dealing with a set of circumstances that people actually quite enjoy, that like what we might term overconsumption. And does that kind of pick a battle that then makes it harder, I suppose, to win on the climate change front? And do we need to separate those out?
Yeah, so I think, and also I think Jan mentioned this as well, there are winners and losers in this system. The thing I would come to on the aviation one is, and people can correct me if I've got this stat wrong, but it's around 70% of flights by 15% of the population, something along those lines. So the reality is that pre-pandemic, 50% of people didn't fly each year anyway. So when Boris Johnson stands up and talks about we will not affect consumer choice, what he's really referring to is will not change and affect consumer choice of the select group of society that I recognise and hang out with. And in reality, that's not the reality for most people. So 50% of people just don't fly each year. You know, to me, that's not one which is high on the agenda. So I agree. This is where we have to also recognise the challenges of vested interests around that. Should we start on the stuff where there's clear co-benefits? Maybe. The problem with this, I suppose, is timeframes and whether that's consistent with it. And that's why I think we almost need this sort of strong, complete narrative of what it could look like, where the benefits are and who the challenges are for. But yeah, I don't have a complete answer at the same time, of course. Yeah.
Thanks, John. Right, so I can see Emily's got a hand up, so going to come back again, which is absolutely fine. I just encourage people. It's really bizarre in this webinar world. You can't see anyone out there, so we don't know how you're responding to what we're saying. But I really would encourage some more people to put questions in the Q&A. We've got another one lined up there, but at the moment we've almost done our 2 questions. You're on to going to be on to questions I've got in a moment, which yeah, probably don't want. So Emily, you were coming back there.
Oh yeah, just a really brief comment on that co-benefits piece, which is just that, you know, co-benefits sound great, but they're really difficult to realise in practice. We did some work a while ago looking at policy mechanisms in support of carbon dioxide removal around the world, and there are actually quite a lot of them. They're all aligned to like different sectors, like agricultural sectors and things like this. And essentially what you learn is that every time someone tries to develop something that's supposed to result in co-benefits, so it's supposed to result in, for example, carbon reduction plus another thing, most of the time the co-benefits fail to materialize and you get one thing or another. And a classic example is China's afforestation policies, a lot of which were for flood reduction, right? Great idea in principle, let's plant shed loads of trees, unfortunately with the wrong kind of trees. And, because they're planted to deal with floods, they're not planted to deal with CO2. And so I think, yeah, it's a great idea. It's really something that we should be pushing for, and there are a lot of potential co-benefits. However, the governance mechanisms that actually bring those co-benefits about need to be looked at a lot more carefully and a lot more critically than I think they sometimes are.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. And I guess, I mean, so we may come back to it in a moment, you know, that isn't a discourse of slowing things down. That's a let's be careful and let's watch what happens and let's do something about it as we experience those things on the way through.
Yeah, let's not assume that we're going to get carbon reductions as a byproduct.
Yeah, yeah. Great. So which probably takes me on to the next question we've got here at the moment, which is, you know, that we've Rachel presented some quite discreet themes out of the work we've been doing, and the question is, was it really as discreet as that? And I mean, I'll let Rachel have the first comment on this, but I think the answer is no, it wasn't as discreet as that. But really asking is, was there synergy between the different themes that we were reflecting on, and indeed, might there be tension between them as well? And really welcome views from any of you. But I will just allow Rachel to sort of comment on the analysis and how we got to where we got to with the themes. So, Rachel.
Yeah, I would say, like you said, Mike, that there's definitely a lot of sort of overlap, and that they're not completely discrete themes at all. And I think that there is between a lot of them significant synergies. So at the sort of, you know, we need to upskill to be able to deploy to deploy ready to go infrastructure. We need to also be doing this sort of in the short term and in the long term. There's a synergy there, I think, between the sort of social legitimacy theme and the policy theme. So do we need social legitimacy before we have policy, or does the policy, if we move on the policy front, will the sort of legitimacy follow? So I think that there were a lot of interesting debates around there, and definitely some strong synergies between the themes.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So I'll move on then to John. As the PI on this project, what do you think about where we got to with the themes and those synergies and maybe tensions?
Yeah, so I think at the beginning, when I first thought about the project and we discussed it, Mike, I had this rather naive vision that we would all be able to collectively come together as academics and create this wonderfully coherent vision of the future. Maybe I was just being hopeful, but that clearly wasn't the case, to be clear. And that might reflect our methodology as well to some extent. So it's difficult to separate those elements, but there clearly are tensions about this. And in a way that's not bad. And what needs to happen more, I think, is that those tensions are played out in different audiences, and that we are open and transparent about what those tensions are and the choices that we're making. And in that respect, I think we've unearthed a sort of some really useful information on where these key tensions sit around the role of technologies versus social transformations, around sense of speed and what does it mean for a ready-to-go technology. And I saw Gavin put a comment in the chat around, you know, heat pumps, they're not ready, you know what I mean? Compared to direct air capture and storage, they are. So it's all relative, I think. So in that respect, it was these kind of sort of tensions that came through. And it makes me feel sometimes that when, let's say, the government releases its net zero plan, there's almost this pretense there's no real problems at all. And I just like an openness and honesty which came out of the workshops to be reflected in public debate around the choices we have and the consequences. And so maybe to start with, I had this naive idea that we might come together. By the end, I actually think it was value that we were valuable to show the contested areas and having decent debates about them.
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, Jan, this does sort of talk to some of the things you were talking about in your 2-minute intro. Where do you feel? I mean, and you've seen some of the debate on the way through as well because you've been participating in it. How do you feel about this question of the themes that we've drawn out and the tensions between those different areas?
I thought it was striking just how much reliance was placed on local action and local leadership and local initiative in the workshops that I've been part of, and even more so in the stakeholder workshop that Rachel presented on earlier. And yet, it seems, you know, and Carly's alluded to this through the Greater Manchester example, it's extremely difficult to create the capacity, the technical resources, the staff resources now to create that sort of meaningful, bring everyone together locally, create direction forwards. We've seen the Place-Based Climate Action Network, which has produced some excellent insights, I think, and examples of how we can create those economic models where there can be some alignment between private sector, public sector, contributors, investments, and generate a richer form of wealth than simply a kind of high level of return on the financial investment. But there's still not really that clarity about how exactly that is going to develop, that momentum can be developed. And Jess Britton and I wrote just a couple of weeks ago a piece trying to appraise what the current net zero strategy and related heat and building strategies and so on say about the coordination between central and local governments. So of course local governments also a devolved power, and yes, they say some positive things in general, but it's still, we'll get there eventually. Well, I don't think we've got time to think about getting there eventually. I think we're in it now. You look at the climate science and you go, yeah, 8 years. We're incredibly good, I think. I used to be a very anti-biologistic view of the humans, but I'm beginning to think that as a species, we're really clever at disguising the mess we're in and compartmentalizing our lives as a matter of necessity, probably. I know I do it too, but I'm not sure where I'm even going with this point, quite honestly, but I'm not sure there how to move on. I think I raised in the discussions already in some of those workshops, we can come out with lots of normative things about what we should be doing, but we're still not identifying, well, how do we make that happen? And, as researchers, what can we be doing more effectively than we currently do?
Thanks, Jan. So I think that probably leads me on actually to the next question, and I'm going to come to Carly and then Emily on it. And actually it's the next 3 questions because all 3 of them are sort of targeting the same thing. It's that, okay, so there's a public out there. There are publics out there that we need to engage with. This, I think part of the answer to the issue Jan was raising there is actually how do we get the rest of society to engage in these issues? What are your thoughts on that? How do we drive this public debate that's needed? And public engagement to a level that really starts to create change? Carly.
Yeah, so I reflected a bit on this, having looked at the report as well. I think I might start from not assuming that it isn't there. So, you know, CAST did some survey work where like 2/3 of the UK public think that climate change is something that has to be dealt with a very high or high level of urgency. And I think if you look back at things like wind power, you had often MPs talking about how much the public didn't like wind, papers talking about how much the public didn't like wind, but actually the stats from polling work don't back that up. So I think being really careful about whether we know what actually is out there, being super careful about the questions we ask people, because, you know, I have reservations about the fact that we still keep asking people about whether they believe in climate change. You know, we don't ask people whether they believe in cancer, you know, like, are they the right people to ask that question of? And sometimes we can go for like quite kind of, you know, short sort of reportable answers that get headlines and things, but actually there's sort of deeper discussions around things like a citizens' assembly about how you actually deliver this are really important. And I think maybe that's why people are so excited about the local level, because it's at the local level where you get these different actors coming together, where it's not always a huge prioritization of economic growth. You know, there's lots of other metrics that local politicians are interested in delivering, and you kind of get that more of that connectivity. And the publics should certainly be part of that. But I don't believe them to be antagonistic as a whole, as it currently stands, because this positive vision of the future that we could talk about is a much better life for many people. The people that it might be a slightly less consumptive and, you know, Ibiza for a short trip based life are perhaps though more powerful in creating what the public discourse is seen to be.
Great, thanks, Carly. We are really right on our final moment now. So, Emily, have you got a final word to say on that before we finish?
I think these kind of three questions have kind of answered each other, which I think is fantastic. It's like, yeah, we need a positive vision of what a just net zero future would look like. We need to stop making mixed messages, because people get really confused when we're talking about action on the one hand and then also spending money on fossil fuel subsidies on the other hand. It's not surprising there are counterclaims in that kind of environment, right? And yeah, we need a dialogue, and the most important thing is we need these insights to actually be delivered. And I guess the good news is that there are a lot of examples of how not to do it, the UK Climate Assembly being one. Fantastic process, really great. Nothing happens out of the recommendations, and so we need a clearer mechanism. And personally, I think that this should be embedded into the process from the start. So instead of waiting to see if they agree with you before you decide to act on the recommendations, you actually just agree to act on the recommendations before you even start. And then you just kind of hope for the best. And yeah, so I'm gonna wrap up there basically.
Right, I think we could carry this on all afternoon, but I before Amber actually stops me dead, I will bring things to a close. So thank you all very much. Thank you everyone out there who's been listening, participating, sending the questions in. Yeah, hopefully we'll see you all at some point in the future in the flesh, but thank you for joining us this afternoon, and goodbye.